And all right,
There we
hello
go.
everyone, and welcome to Unexpected Predictions online, and our Q&A, or what we call sometimes up close. And this is a part of the day, part of the week, where we get to talk about different things related to improv. And you get to pose questions, and we'll try to answer them. I'm kind of here as a conversationalist, and we're going to have primarily Tony Beeman talking about genre, and he has an upcoming genre class, which we'll get to at some point. But we thought it'd be interesting to just have a discussion between us about doing genre work and what goes into it, and what we like or don't like, what we've seen and done that we like and don't like. And again, if you have particular questions about a favorite genre or a problem you've run into with genre work, or other little tips that you're interested in finding out more about, or if you want to share them too, feel free. Um, but uh, Ladies and gentlemen, Tony Beeman.
Hello. Thanks for letting me be here.
Yeah.
So,
No, that's great. So you do a lot of work with genre, and like
yeah.
working with genre. I love working with genre. And I guess, what do you find challenging in genre that's different than, say, the rest of like regular improv? But there are added challenges or things that make it easier, more difficult.
I think I think both in a lot of ways. When I read a lot, I read a lot, and I came to improv actually with a poetry degree. So I came to it with a lot of like wanting to tell a lot of different types of stories. But I also came to it with a very like intellectual, analytical understanding of style.
Right.
Um, and so while I loved it, when I first jumped into it, I found that like style could really put me in my head, and maybe it's just a Western culture thing, but it often would encourage me at least to. I was like the Yoda quote about how Luke is like always looking at the horizon and never like where he is, what he's doing. So I think often style at first to people seems like a barrier, an obstacle. That puts them in their head, that encourages them not to just like be present in the moment. Um, but conversely, what I love about style is when approached in healthy ways, I think, allows people to really, I think, kind of put on a different mask. To put it in kind of Johnstonian terms, I think like a style is just another mask you might wear. And when you approach it like that, I think it actually is an invitation to do new things, to approach things differently, and to see that very moment you're in a very different way without putting a lot of intellectual thought into it, assuming you've done the prep work ahead of time. So,
Cool. Cool. And it's kind of a advanced question right away, but in terms of, so maybe I get a little bit ahead, but the question popped in my head. In terms of resources and where people can go to get stuff, and we can talk the more specific things later. Do you find certain styles lend themselves more to, like, I think something like, film noir is pretty easy to find a lot of stuff about, whereas a lesser style is more difficult to find stuff out about.
yeah, I put it in two camps. There's stuff you can find a million things about Shakespeare if you want. Now, whether or not it's helpful is another question. So I'd say two things. One, how much material is there? How many people have sort of revisited that style or worked on it in different ways? And that can be both good, but also negative. My wife's a costumer, so she talks a lot about like secondary resources, where like, okay, I can go to Shakespeare's plays originally, but a lot of people produced it. If I start referencing what other people have done, that's secondary. And so a lot of stuff's been done so much, you're not necessarily even improvising in the original style. You're kind of improvising in a copy of the style.
Right.
Um, the other, for me, the maybe the biggest thing that tells me whether something is going to be easy or hard to put on stage is what sort of conflict is it? If it's, I think McKee in his book on story talks about like fiction, a lot of fiction is going to be a lot of internal conflict, right? A lot of inner monologue, stuff like that. A lot of movies today are like very external conflict, right? We're going to fly around the world, James Bond, and like fight these secret organizations. Um, and you can do those styles on stage, but you're going to have to turn it into interpersonal conflict in some way because your audience wants to watch two human beings like interact. So if a style can be like put into the terms of like two actors engaging that, I think you can bring it to stage. Some stuff it's very hard to do that.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's the copy of a copy thing. That's one of the early frustrations I had with style, especially with Shakespeare, where I was seeing improv groups not doing Shakespeare, but they were doing what they saw as an improvised version of Shakespeare.
Yep.
Getting back to that source material becomes important. And I love the internal conflict thing, especially around those action genres like James Bond. And part of that is that I think the translation piece. How do we translate what works on a screen into something that people can watch on stage? So let's see. How important is it to like a specific genre? Doing a genre you don't like can make it more challenging. And hello from Italy. Hi, Andrea.
I would say, actually, I'll leave that question up. It depends. One thing that we were talking about was parody versus pastiche,
Yeah.
which I'll quickly define as parody. You can kind of take a quick extrinsic or outside view of it, understand it, and you can mock it or you can enjoy it, but like highlight the things that make it stand out. I think it can be fun to parody a style you don't like, if that's your goal. And unexpected, we're more likely to do, but what I'd say is pastiche, which is like really trying to honor the original work, and kind of come to it from an intrinsic point of view. If you don't like it, I mean, one would be why are you spending your time on it when there's so many other things you could do? Um, but at the end of the day, I always hope. Like the first genre I ever worked on was you directed it. I proposed it was improvise. It was the improvised man Ray Bradbury, who I love, and it's like, what if Ray Bradbury was an improviser? Was kind of the question I remember posing to you for that. It's like I wanted to get in Ray Bradbury's head and ask what would he do as an improviser. If I don't like Ray Bradbury, I'm gonna have a hard time probably getting in his head because presumably Ray liked himself. So I think I would have to find something I love about it to really do it as pastiche, even if I have problems with it too.
Yeah.
We did
Yeah.
improvise Woody Allen a few years ago, who's become a problematic figure, and like it was fun. It probably lived halfway between like parodying his neuroses, but like really enjoying the stuff he was good at. Um,
Right. Yeah, just a couple brief thoughts on that and answer the question. One is for me, if I don't like a style, I sort of make it a challenge to like find the one thing I'm going to like about the style through the research and through the work. Like what's this playwright, writer, filmmaker, whatever, doing that somehow appeals to me. Doesn't have to be deep or big. It doesn't have to change my life, but finding that way in to me is is pretty important. And the thing about pastiche, I think, is absolutely true. So, kind of doing the same thing that we talk about with at least at UP about opera and ballet. If we're doing improvised Ray Bradbury, it's like the cast and everybody should be trying to do an absolute. This is the story Ray Bradbury would write, because we can't do it. We're not Ray Bradbury, right? But if we're honest about it and we're true, and it's an honest attempt, I think that shows here. What I find annoying in improvised genre work is the parody stuff with the wink wink to the audience of, oh, we're poking fun of this, and I'm like, well, why are you poking fun of it? You can't do it. So try to be as earnest as possible and find those things in a really honest way. So what do you have a favorite genre and your least favorite genre, I guess?
um, man, that's a tough question. So I'll limit the stuff we've done on stage. I do love film noir. Maybe probably because it does translate to stage so well. And I've done UP as a show you've directed many times, Black Eye Blonde, which I think I've done every time we've done it. And I ended up doing a devised work, an adaptation of Wizard of Oz called Scarecrow for Hire in the style of film noir. But going back to the idea of the mask, um, what I like as a performer performing in a genre is like what's that character's point of view? Like how do they see the world? And film noir has some really interesting ones that a lot of like Chandler will talk about. About you have this sometimes a detective, but often not. They often have this very black and white view of how the world should be. Um, Very idealistic, and they've been broken by that, by the fact the world doesn't match that ideal. Um, and so I love it because moment to moment, if I'm playing that character, I kind of know how to react. I know how to feel about everything. So I can approach it, even though it's a very technical style in some ways, I can approach it very emotionally. I unsurprisingly don't play a lot of femme fatales, but it's like I love that point of view of how like I deserve to have control over my life, but I'm not allowed to in this sort of misogynistic world. So I'm gonna go behind the scenes and like manipulate my way into making the things happen that I think should happen.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it's got all these great characters who have very opposing viewpoints in the world that are still relevant today. As everyone's outraged and upset about how they think the world should be going versus how it is going.
Right.
So it's my favorite. My least favorite, and for anything least favorite, it's probably just I haven't yet figured out how to do it on stage. But it's a lot of like really big, action oriented, complicated genres. And I just often don't feel I do a good job of approaching it. So things with really complicated plot structures, and they go to a lot of locations. Um, and especially when improvisers try to tell the whole story, um, I pick on 7-part story a lot because I think a good a good play is like a short story. It doesn't cover the whole once upon a time all the way to until finally. It covers a small piece of it.
Right.
Um, so I like any style where I can just take that little piece of it and play with it. So improvised James Bond it wouldn't excite me at the start. I would like to do a scene in the style of James Bond, but if I were to tell the whole story, it's like, well, is the person to person stuff the interesting part there? I don't know.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yeah, I'm focused on the scene work. Yeah. So, do you tend to feel safer performing in a genre-esque, structured-ish show versus something like a herald or open scene work?
uh, that's a that's a good question. It depends. And I think this is true of UP, Randy. I'm curious what you think. I think unexpected a number of performers who do a lot of heralds, things like that, are maybe more comfortable with the open-ended stuff than other theaters. Um, and I would say that format has the potential to go much better than a show with more structure or rules, and the potential to go much worse than um, a show with any kind of like, if an open-ended show falls apart, it falls apart pretty hard in my experience. Um, but uh, I would not say I've come to feel safer, but maybe that's because we're lucky to have a theater where we sort of embrace the like failing during open-ended work. Um, but I do find it's easier to get people on the same page with a style or a genre. So it gives you a starting place. So if I'm performing with my friends, I'm like when I say I mean like people I perform with regularly, and open-ended shows like free and exploratory and interesting. Um, if if I don't know the audience or I don't know the people I'm performing with, it can be safer, but safer is not always good. That can be my answer.
Right.
I'm curious how you would answer that question, Randy.
Well, yeah, I would say that I think at UP, what we try to do is work without structure and direct people, have them learn about how a style actually works. Like what's the fingerprint of the style? Because if you have that, then you can kind of go almost anywhere. So it's a difference. Example I use, which you've probably heard a million times, is it's like being able to play piano by looking at sheet music and following the structure of the sheet music, and then next song, next sheet music, versus like just being able to make music on a piano. And if I know how to just make the music, then I can kind of go anywhere, and then that can take your genre work into interesting places where the genre may not have even gone. If we did I don't know, a film noir in a a nunnery or something like that, you could just take it there. And one of my favorite examples of that was in 2006, 5, 6, 6, 7, I can't remember. 2 years we did the Colorado Shakespeare Festival, Shakespeare, full on Shakespeare for Shakespeare audiences. I was in direct, and Ron Hippie directed it. But I loved his approach about like we didn't decide, is it a tragedy, a comedy, a history. We let the offers from within the show tell us. So rather than following like, oh, we're doing the comedy structure, we got to follow these steps. It gave us much more freedom, which I really loved. And I think the more you can do that, the more you can, the more you can do with it. So,
Hey, I was thinking it may also have to do with the type of show and the type of structure. Because I'm thinking of I do a show, House of Ink, and it's a show I like to travel with because it's six real life authors in a mansion being murdered one by one, trying to figure out who the murderer is. And when we first did it, we had, I think it was some spot that opened up, so we had like 2 weeks to rehearse it. Um, and so I wanted a format where people would already have done their homework because people have their own favorite authors they wanted to play. And because it's a murder mystery, I did not want anybody in their head like worrying about who the murderer was. So I literally had the audience like pick the murderer. One audience member secretly picks the murderer, and everyone just plays it as if they might be the murderer. And what I wanted was it's just an excuse. Like the murder mystery is just an excuse to watch these authors interact with each other. And I didn't want anybody worrying about narrative. So I just literally structured like you're going to be in these scenes. Like it's kind of had a deck of cards. It was This part was overly complicated, but in the end, when you ended up a scene, you're like, I just know like I have to die at some point in this scene. And so about a third of my performers were like, this was overly structured, and they wanted to like play the mystery and have fun with the narrative. About 2/3 just like enjoyed playing the author in those moments, like cooking up, being scared, and playing off of each other. So it was an example of like, well, structure can be freeing. Or Improvised Christmas Carol, our most structured show we do, where we're following the whole outline of Christmas Carol. But that's one of my favorite shows we do because I know it's on rails. So in the moment, we can go wherever we want because we know by the end of the scene it's going to end up on the rails. And I don't ever have to go into my head
mm-hmm.
and like worry about how to get it on the rails. And that's what I'd say bad structure is. If my performers are like worrying about how to get it back on the rails, I've probably given them a very unhelpful structure.
Right. So if you're tripping over the structure, right. And do we think genre improv makes shows easier for an audience to follow and like?
Um, I think it can. I would say we get new audiences often when we put a genre up.
Right.
My wife Janine Clark directs a show I'm in, Improvise original series Star Trek, which kind of lives halfway between not through UP, but just she'll put it up around the city, and we usually get big audiences, many of whom never seen improv, and they have this immediate way to latch onto it. Um, on the other hand, I've seen plenty of the times that lets the improvisers off the hook for creating stakes or telling us who these characters are, or like there's a lot of it gives you a lot of shortcuts, some of which are really dangerous, right? So, oh, you already know who Dr. McCoy is. Do I need to bother letting you know, like, hey, he cares about the health of his crew, but also about emotions and feelings? So if I'm lazy as an improviser, I can kind of take a shortcut and avoid doing that work, and I think that leads to a worse show. Um, but
Right.
for the audience point of view, um, probably if you do it well.
Hmm.
But they also bring in their own expectations and often incorrect. Star Trek's a great example. If you actually watch Star Trek, Spock rarely has feelings. They're competent. Kirk usually follows the rules. McCoy never says "damn it, Jim." And so we've like like audience comes with all these memeified expectations, and you have to kind of decide: am I going to give them what they want, which is going to be more like parody? That's what J.J. Abrams did. His parody was more parody than our improvised Star Trek, I think. Um, or do you like honor the source material? In which case, it can your audience. You have to decide: am I is audience still getting what they want? And if they aren't, is that okay?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it can be easier, especially when people come with the expectations of a given genre. So, like Star Trek or Star Wars, or these things, Lord of the Rings, are easy. The dilemma I always have in genre work is a lot of the genres I've enjoyed working on or want to do are genres that nobody is going to see. Right? They're just not familiar enough with the genre to do it. So, it require homework, maybe perhaps on the part of the audience. That being said, the flip side of that, which is something that we've talked about a lot, Tony, is my ongoing feeling about if you do your pick your trendy show right now version of improvised version of that, then the only people who come and see it are people who are fans of the show. And I miss the step where we teach them how to love improvisation uh, by coming to the show, because those people are never going to come back until the next time you do that genre show. So I don't know if you've had that in your experiences working with these like bigger, well-known styles like Star Trek. Do you get improv? I'm sure you get both, but would you say most people are Star Trek fans or they're improv fans? Come for
Yeah,
the improv or come for the Star Trek?
I would say start. You get more Star Trek fans, and they kind of wait for it to come around. And they're often. I mean, I had this experience as a student. I saw like improvised Christmas Carol, which was very accessible, and then I came and saw like a student Herald, and I was like, what the f is like? um, it, just like any art form, right? Like there's accessible poetry, and there's like if you throw someone in T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, which is still more accessible than a lot, they're going to be lost, right? It's going to feel
Right.
pretentious, or they're just not
Yeah.
going to have the vocabulary. Um,
But,
so
but it's hilarious the wasteland.
yes, yes, come see our Eliot parody show. um, so, uh, but it always seemed like we pick up like 10% of those people, and like it really, like some of the people have that like who now are performers or like who really stuck with our classes for a long time seem to have come through one of those big shows. So I do think it's a great gateway. It's just don't be surprised if the people who are there for your improvised Trek show aren't excited by your sort of weird unstructured herald you do the next week, and vice versa, right? In
Right.
many ways. So
Yeah. What are some of the traps performers fall into working in a genre?
uh, I mentioned one. I think a couple I've mentioned already, but I'll highlight because I think they're big. Are the approaching it from an intellectual point of view.
Hmm.
Um, so as a director, I didn't always do this, but uh, I'll say when I began, I approached genre from a narrative point of view, and I would get compliments after shows like, "Ah, you, it was smart," or like "you're smart," or "you get narrative." And I started noticing it was other performers who always got the like, "I love that moment" compliments. And they like, and Tony did a good job keeping us on track. Um, so the first would be thinking you got to do the intellectual homework outside off stage, but bringing that on stage I think is a huge mistake because it takes you out of the moment. And so you've kind of got to trust. It's a great book, Inner Game of Tennis by Galloway, who sort of says in Western culture we're often guilty of thinking the brain's in charge of physicality and the body, which already knows how to do amazing things like catch a ball. And I extend that to the emotional life or emotional lives in theater of you've got to do the work to get out of your head by the time you're on stage. So to use Edgar Allan Poe as an example, right? I'd like better not be thinking too much about language or about where the story needs to go, but I'd better be thinking about like this Edgar Allan Poe character is probably worried that people think he's insane because he is insane, and he's deeply concerned with convincing people he's not. And he's horrified by everything that he sees is just like it's knocking him off his like little stability he has. So um, if I'm not approaching it from that emotional point of view, um, or in film noir, right? Like we talked about the emotional side. Also, just what am I wearing? How am I moving through the space? If I'm not physicalizing and playing in the emotions, I'm going to go in my head. And I don't know if you have this experience. The longer I perform, the more I I can see in people's eyes when they disconnect, when they go into their heads. Um, and so I see that a lot when people are performing in genre, when they kind of disconnect, go in their heads, and they're trying to figure out what to do next, not as a character, but as a performer.
Right.
So,
Huh. Cool. And along those lines, in addition to the traps that we fall into, what do you think the job of the performing improviser is in terms of when you're in the show? Is it conveying the style, being true to whatever author you're doing? And how does that work for or against what's going on in the room? So, what's the story that wants to be told?
I I'm gonna I'm gonna couch my answer with it probably does depend on the genre. In fiction styles, I still think the primary job of the performer is to take care of the character they're embodying, like to truly embody the character, and to have already done the homework to make sure that that character fits in the style. And then it's like if I know what a character wants in a given style, and then I know the rules of the universe. So if it's Jane Austen, right? Like I know what I want is to find a stable marriage that I'll be happy in, but also my family will be taken care of. But I know the rules are I can't like talk to people I haven't been introduced to. I've got to like move through the room in this huge dress. I've got to like it's my job to know what those rules are, embody them, play the emotional life of the characters, and then just totally otherwise be present to what's going on with my scene partners, with the other characters, with the audience, with the music. Um, so so all that prep work to me is so that I don't have to do any of that work on stage.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
uh,
Oh, in an episodic genre like a TV show, how do you balance telling a complete story with making the universe feel unlimited?
huh. Um, well, and should the universe feel unlimited if it's episodic? I'm trying to think of our episodic shows we did. I wasn't part of it. It was before my time. Where's Earth? I remember. Um, and Jay Head, our managing director, has done. Actually, now I think about he's directed a couple of episodic because he did Black Ice recently. Um, to me, it's like well, Comedia had like a set of characters, right? And they weren't if we're talking about episodic, like in the 80s or 90s, where everything has to return to the status quo, I think it's challenging, and you probably have to say what I'm exploring is the life of these characters during this short period of time, right? And like we'll return things to where they are. If we're talking about an ongoing episodic thing, that's harder because then you've got to figure out what does the audience already know, what do they need to know, how do I communicate
Right.
all that.
Right.
Um, But Tramplin Falls, you and I were both in, directed by my fellow co-artistic associate Laurel. And in that, I think we gave ourselves the freedom to like, if I remember, to like not have to like keep the status quo going, right? Like if someone
Right.
needed to die, we would just bring them back the next week. Um, because I think if we really hadn't done it, it would be limiting, and maybe the way Alex is referring to.
Right. Yeah, we did a couple of things as improvised soap operas because it was back in the day when you had the sitcom reset where everyone had to end up where it was. But we did a hospital drama called The Healing Ones and uh, one called The Av, which was about a news magazine, TV news magazine. And we played them as soap operas. And then we had conventions that worked with that. But in relation to Alex's question, one thing we did was we had ongoing stories. So they had things that carried, week to week to week, and we actually built a fairly decent ongoing audience that came back just to kind of see what happened to the characters. But in each show, we would always have one complete arc of something. And it may have been introduced episodic wise, for that episode, or it may have been the wrap up of something that had been going on for a while. But there was always one complete thing within all these other hanging stories that went on, and we were able to do a pretty good job of recapping. Like, here's where everybody's at the top of the show, and now, I mean, it's kind of funny if you think about like TV now, and like say Star Trek original series. It'd be kind of funny if they add that carry on where it's like Kirk and Spock are talking. It's like, remember that alien last week, or
Right.
that kind of thing, where you have the ongoing lives of these characters, but you always had that reset. So uh,
Well, there are so many different types of episodic shows, but one I like from a improvising point of view, one I'm always attracted to are like, well, I was my wife directed it, but the Doctor, which is improvised Doctor Who, like Quantum Leap or the Hulk, or these show formats where a couple of characters are your through line, but you every week you walk into a completely new like situation, so you get like that the best of both worlds in some ways, the like freedom to um, just kind of go wherever you need, and so you have often one set of improvisers kind of creating whatever they want, letting it go, and then a couple of characters to like sort of have some maybe more longer term stakes.
right,
So, um, comment from Kurt here.
yeah,
As a complete layman and admirer of improv from the perspective of an audience member only, this is a fascinating conversation that's helped me understand the rigorous academic and intellectual work that goes into the skill development behind improv. Cut to a bunch of advisors drinking and watching YouTube videos. But thanks for deepening my appreciation of the art form. And by the way, greetings from the past.
that's for me. Hi, Kurt. Good to hear.
Uh, yeah, thank you. I guess that's one of the reasons I love performing genre two is it's super interesting work, and it often just the work itself leads to a lot of interesting questions.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot through genre simply by getting genres, sometimes in even short form shows where I'm like, I'm not sure I know that very well, but then that always sent me uh, somewhere, originally to books and now to the computer and books, um, to get more familiar with that, whatever that genre was, because it might come up again. And so I want to know what it was. So I discovered a lot of things, some things I really love that I probably wouldn't have discovered if it hadn't come up in an improv show, I think.
I often tell my students in my styles class. We're supposed to be marketing, by the way. I am teaching style
Yes.
in
Yes. When is
genre
that, by the
class.
way? Nice segue.
It is June. It's the beginning of June. Hopefully, someone in chat will remind me. I want to say June 7th. It's going to be Sundays at. I'm going to make sure. Sundays at 4 p.m. starting in June 7th,
Right.
for 8 weeks. So, and it'll be online. So we'll have a chance to sort of tackle some stuff. But to go back, one of the things I get out of every genre I'm in, because I often say this to my students, is you want to get to the place doing the work ahead of time. Every author sort of has like a heads up display, like in the Terminator, where like what gets highlighted. Because as an improviser, if you're not have to think about it, you still want to be able to recognize offers that are like would be important to that scene work. So if I'm wearing my like Terminator Jane Austen view, and I walk into a scene and like Randy's like mildly rude to me, that's huge, right? It like lights up with a little green outline. Versus if I'm like Isaac Asimov, that probably doesn't even register, but like, but whatever he's doing might register, right? Like,
Wow.
or what his job is. So I always walk out of every genre, like kind of walking around the world, seeing like, oh, a few different things are highlighted right now. Like that's interesting here.
Wow, you've kind of blown my mind. You've got meta to use genre to describe genre.
Oh yeah, yes. Come see my new Terminator Jane Austen show.
Especially Terminator and Jane Austen.
Right.
All
Hey,
right.
Dave Clapper.
Hey, Dave. You mentioned earlier how fiction genre improv differs from nonfiction and gave examples of fiction. What are some of the challenges of nonfiction improv, and what are some styles of nonfiction improv?
Well, I don't know if I'm supposed to say it. I think they'll be okay. I've been looking at Ken Burns' documentaries with 4 and 20, just because we're all living in this Zoom world anyway. So, documentary is one we get a lot, which I would say a number of things. A lot of nonfiction is presenting a lot of information, a lot of visuals. Um, and it's not. It depends. A lot of it's not necessarily geared for on stage, right? Because it's geared to bring in all this other external stuff. But I think you can look at like biographies, and Dave was in our, which lived between the two, maybe a little more toward fiction than nonfiction, Skid Road, which is the history of Seattle and the style of Deadwood, um, where we wanted to at least we didn't want the audience to think they were getting the truth, but we wanted to like give them a little doorway into like the history of Seattle, which has an amazing history that we have so many transplants. Not a lot of people know it, so we kind of wanted to open that up, and but I would say the rules of the game, if they're coming to improv theater, they probably expect it to be entertaining at some, or engaging, I should say, which I think is better than entertaining. Um, and it's still that same thing I said about conflict. You've got to have stuff between people,
Right.
and we can think about people who've solved it on TV, right? Like Unsolved Mysteries basically tried to take like nonfiction and make it like interesting to a television audience.
Right. I think the problem with nonfiction is oftentimes it is best served in the a bad habit in improv, which is you're talking about the past, and like you're talking about Unsolved Mysteries, or whatever, where they tried to recreate and kind of turn it into a dramatic show. With some people love it, some people hate it. But I think that becomes the challenge, is relating to the past and looking at the intertwinedness of the documentaries. Like Ken Burns, he does that thing about where he lays eggs at the very beginning of everything, and then 2 episodes later he comes back and revisits it, and that would require some really intense listening, I think, on perhaps the improvisers. Maybe that's what you're discovering.
Yeah, um, yeah. It's so nonfiction is so broad. I think it's hard to like. I think it comes down to how do you different and like what theater has like accomplished interesting nonfiction, right? Like there's a lot of like one person shows that are you know biopic or
Yeah, yeah,
basically
documentary theater. Yeah,
yeah. And I would say maybe a lot of our open ended shows, especially that you've introduced, Randy, are kind of nonfiction in that, but they're of the lives of the improviser. We have formats that really use an improviser having an expertise. So, like, I'm trying to think of our slide or one we did in Improv Anonymous where
we did
someone
show and tell.
show and tell, yeah, where someone would come in and just talk about, similar to an Armando, um, where someone would bring in props and like set up and talk about a subject while the improvisers played off of that.
Right, a subject they were excited about, or
Yeah,
an idea that they knew a lot about. Yeah. And by the way, your class is on Sundays starting June 7th from 4 to 6 on Zoom.
excellent. There we go. Yes, just on Zoom. So,
Let's see. How do you decide which set, prop, costume elements to bring into a stage genre show? And how do you make sure they are conducive to play instead of limiting?
It's funny you're asking the two of us because uh, I think both of us agree they get in the way a lot. But I also bring in a warehouse full of costumes every year for improvised Christmas Carol because I play the ghosts in genres. Um, I'm going to start by how they're limiting, which actually, Brandy, you were telling an anecdote the other day, I think, about watching a show early on in which a performer took so much time getting a costume on that by the time they came out, the moment had passed, right? Um, so anything that takes a performer away from like watching what's going on stage, and and maybe limits their choices or encourages them to like do the funny or clever pre-planned thing over what the moment actually needs is limiting, and costume so often falls into that. Um, so I'd also add once you add a prop, it's like why do you not have all the props? So
Yeah, I was going to ask you how you felt about the notion, which we've all sometimes had to do, which is, oh, we have the pad and the pen, but we don't have the glass, that kind of thing.
um, so in general, I go minimal for styles when I can. That said, every once in a while, like even the greatest mimes. In Skid Road, we brought in actual. We went through so much Lipton tea because everyone drank back then. So we literally, Sarah Wood, our poor tech, would make like 5 pitchers of iced tea so we can have glasses and people would actually be drinking because even our best, like our people who are best at object work, there's something satisfying about watching someone actually hold the physical object, about the way they move, and that becomes a mask itself, I think. And I'm married to a costumer, right? So again, when people are actually wearing those clothes, they move differently.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, like there are times to really go for that production value, not for the spectacle of it, but because it actually enhances and changes the performer's experience.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe that's my best way of answering it is it helping your performer achieve your goals or is it just getting in the way?
Yeah, and I think it gets in the way when it becomes about that, like, oh, my costume's doing all the work,
Yeah.
instead of like it's just what I'm wearing because it's Chekhov, or it's just what I'm wearing because it's this period piece. Just a quick thing adding on to that, because I like minimizing. If I have to add elements every time, I just kind of go, oh, too bad I had to add that. Because I just love keeping it simple and left to the imagination of performers and audience. But when we did Moliere, he does a lot of stuff with obviously masks, props, things like that. So we brought those in, but I was also trying to keep it to 3 or 4 elements versus probably 10 that you would have in an actual Moliere show. So it limited the choices of even the props that the actors could use. So
We did a version of Black Eyed Blonde, the film noir show, a few years ago with Improv Anonymous, where we picked our roles ahead of time so that we could wear the costumes. But I remember Randy brought in these cap guns, which mostly worked, but not always, and the caps would fall out, so we would get random gunshots throughout the show when someone would step on a cap, um, which worked when we embraced it, right? But my constant foe in genre work is gunshots on stage. Um, so,
the wow, you're getting complimented for your Teletubby.
yes,
Um,
one of my most disturbing.
uh,
Oh,
Related to that run of Black Eyed Blonde, which I thought was funny, and the cap guns in particular, we had 2 cap guns by the end that worked. So Austin, who was playing the detective, had one because he actually had to shoot people, and then we had one gun that worked. So the thing is, you would walk into a scene and somebody would pull a gun on you, and they can't shoot you because the gun doesn't work. So I found it to be really a great offer because I go, we have to find some other way out of this. One person's going to have to disarm the other one, or they're going to have to let him go, or whatever, because we're not going to have a gunshot. Um, and I thought that was kind of an interesting limitation to the prop. And I thought if I ever did it again, I might try that again. It happened totally by accident. It was not my choice, but I would go, okay, these 2 guns work, the rest don't. So pay attention.
our good friend Dave Morris, when they did improvised Tarantino, and his comment was, he's like, "Well, we're Canadian. Like, we really don't want to watch guns like you Americans do." But so he intentionally brought wooden guns, just to like kind of reduce audience tension around it. And then they had red confetti they used, and they would just like have it stuffed in their clothes and like hurl it out. And I think it in the hands of the wrong director, I think that would just be distracting and gimmicky. But it to them became an element of play, and of kind of joy to it. And it wasn't like they had five other things like that. It was like it was just that. And so it was a neat solution that again I would say like it enabled and empowered the performers to still be present and to like create things I think they otherwise couldn't.
Yeah, and it's playing. I did a Tarantino. I was in a Tarantino in Berlin, and they used bananas as guns.
There you
They weren't
go.
allowed to, I don't think they were allowed to have weapons on stage, but I could be wrong. But it was bananas.
Nice. Yeah, I was trying to think if
So, you want to talk more about your Teletubby?
I'll talk about Christmas Carol. How's that? So we do improvise Christmas Carol, and it's the same. You know, it's we get like 30 suggestions up top, and in recent years I've always played the Ghost, which I love because the Ghost is always. I think these days we do the Ghost of Christmas Past is a movie genre. The Ghost of Christmas Present is a playwright. And back before my time, I believe you used to do a dance style as the Ghost of Christmas Future. Um, but we don't do that. But it's one of my favorite approaches to the genre, and that's the one I do bring costume in because it's a mask. Um, but it's still, it's like the story's written, and the job of the ghost is always my job is to wake Scrooge up to the fact that like if it's the Ghost of Christmas Past, actually to like probably wake him up to the fact that like hey, like he really did have like a hard, sad childhood, and he once had these great things that were taken from him or her. If Jill's playing Scrooge, and in the present, it's to like wake Scrooge up to like how they're living their life now, and so like I have those, and and I've seen a few theaters really refine this. I think Impro in LA does a good job of like really figuring out what is the like core motivation of this character. Like, what's the thing I want? So in Christmas Carol, it's great. I already know what I want. It's to change Scrooge. But then, how am I going to do it? Like, we got Teletubbies one night, and I put on this stupid onesie, I like Pikachu onesie I had, which is really creepy looking and like a baby face. Um, and limited to like, oh, and like that's sad. Um, but I love it because there's no way to plan it, right? Like I can put on the costume, but I have no idea what's going to go on. I don't know what Scrooge is going to do. Like how Scrooge going to be changed by whatever I do. I just know I'm going to throw that style as hard as I can at Scrooge for the goal of changing Scrooge. And it if it ever there are times it's too much, I'm sure, but to keep it from becoming too much is always throwing it right back at Scrooge. Everything I do is for Scrooge to get Scrooge to change. So that's been a good exercise in genre work for me. But that whole idea of like knowing exactly what you want brought about Four Hearts, which is maybe my favorite show I've directed, which is Improvise Edward Albee. And it comes down to if you watch Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, these people are awful to each other, but I like them, I get them, and because I think they want sympathetic things, right? Like the core, like the little child inside of them wants a thing that makes sense. So for Four Hearts, we talked to audience beforehand, and we're like, we asked for not them, but relationships they know they're not sure how they work, and we try to get a sympathetic view. So an abusive partner, it might just their sympathetic view might be like if I don't keep things under control, they will fall apart and everybody will get hurt, right? Like so we try to find what's that sympathetic core. So I'm not just playing an abuser who's a villain, but I'm playing a character sympathetically without like eye to where it's going. It often some of our simplest suggestions turn us into horrible people. Um, I think Cynthia, who I saw there on chat, once got I think it was Cynthia or was it Jill who got I want to be on a boat. I'd rather be on a boat. and ended up playing one of the worst characters I think we ever saw. So
Well, it was interesting about Four Hearts that I found was that notion that you gave us at the beginning about we're doing it in the style of Edward Albee, but we're not going to tell the audience we're doing it in the style of Edward Albee,
right.
which then I think, at least for me, freed me up a lot because then I wasn't looking for those things. Okay, how would Edward Albee do this? I could kind of do that in my head, but the audience didn't have the expectation that that was going to happen.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's going back to the earlier question. It's a good example of structure versus non-structure, right? Just allowing the free fall to happen because there was virtually almost no structure to it.
It was literal, and we had people asking us, trying to figure out the structure. It was literally, it's a dinner party. We're going to start with the host, and two people are going to show up, and then, right?
Right.
Like, that was it. And so, but it was spring, and I was lucky to have a great cast. So,
yeah, we were going to be doing it again if it weren't for
yes,
quarantine. So it'll be coming back at some point.
yeah. When I
Hopefully.
thought about shows to do over Zoom, that was not on the list. I'm like, that would just be depressing and dark over Zoom, I think.
Right. How about the job of the director? What's your job in terms of, and I don't mean the research part or, because when I'm directing a genre, I'm sending out a bunch of stuff and you do the same thing where it's just a bunch of links and different interesting things for the cast to look at. But in the room with your cast.
Um, I'd say, well, first is just casting the right people. And in genre work especially, I think I tend to cast two types of people in my genre shows. There's performers who I would not say like who tend to play a certain type of character or a certain range of characters, not outside. And many of them, in that they're in the same way. There's great character actors and great leads and things like that. In no way, it's great to have improvisers who fit in those different worlds. If someone plays a specific way, I'm not likely to cast them in a genre that they don't fit in, or I'm less likely to. And then there's and again, mean this as a compliment, there's the tofu improvisers who I think will adapt. So when I'm playing a genre, I'm just careful not to pick people who tend to bring a lot of one way of playing to a genre that is going to be a distraction in. Or is going to get in the way because I'm not going to have time to convince them to improvise differently when directing, nor is it my job. So I think that's 75% of the right work is getting the right people in the room, and I will say it's got to be people who will do the homework. There's that, but on top of that. When I first started directing, I made the mistake of just kind of I would be like, here's what I think needs to happen in the show. And then I would just say that to my performers and they would all be in their heads looking down the road, trying to like make the thing happen. I'm not saying I'm honest with my performers about what I want, but I do think as a director, you have to look at the style. I talked about types of conflict, right? How can I end up representing the type of conflict I need for this style and the subject material on stage? And B, how do I solve these problems in a way that when given to the performer never has to do more than be in the moment in a scene. So like, what do they need to know that's helpful to them in the moment, not what's helpful to them 5 scenes later. And that can be very different, but it's a lot of just giving them access to the things a character needs to know and access to like, why does the author make certain choices with their characters? So a show that like I liked a lot, but it took some finessing to get it right, I thought, was Vonnegut. We did improvise Kurt Vonnegut. And I probably threw a lot because we didn't have a lot of time to rehearse. So everyone read a lot. Everyone read a lot of different stuff. I think people were in maybe different directions because of that. And it took a while to get to the bottom of, okay, I think what this is the way we did it. We've got like a Greek chorus who are just us they're like heightened versions of us, human beings who live in the real world. And they're going to talk about whatever they are led to talk about. But they're not living in a fictional world. versus characters who do live in a fictional world. Um, and so that was all of that's too much to give to performers. But just like if you're in this role, just do this, and if you're playing the character, just do this is a more helpful thing to give to a performer, I think. And then just little things like what are the warm ups that put you in the right place? What are language things to help you get in the right way of speaking? So again, you're not worrying about language; you're authentically just expressing emotions through the right language. So
Cool. All right. Cynthia's confirming that it was her, and
yeah,
it turned out to be an awful person.
excellent.
So, all right. Um, as you have seen, you mentioned a couple groups before. You mentioned the group, Dave's group in Victoria and Improv Theater and stuff like that. Um, are there other groups that you kind of go, wow, they're really good at this particular
Yeah.
genre? Or
Well, one I always love, and I know you love, just seeing people from a country do their genre, because they bring so much of their own, like understanding. I can academically maybe get 10% of the understanding of it. So like we had Yuri brought a bunch of students, and they did no theater for us, and they did kabuki theater for us, and it was just great. It was fantastic watching them. I don't even think it was something they developed for performance. They just like jumped up and showed us. It was just fantastic to see. Um, so I love that. It's like why I love watching improv theater do noir, because they're like literally in LA, where like uh, most of those shows, you know, most of those movies were filmed. So I love stuff like that. I like people of different who have a background in other stuff. Like I love dancers, watching dancers present stuff. Um, so that's my first one. And then a lot of it's personal preference. Like I've mentioned improv a few times because I think they approach it from the way I like to do it, which is like from a character centric point of view, not from a structural point of view, in my experience. Um, so those tend to theaters that do that. Personally, that's what I'm most drawn to. That doesn't mean I don't have room to go watch a parody show every once in a while, but if I watch too much parody, like I'm going to pick on them because they deserve it. I went and saw there's a famous improvised Shakespeare show in Chicago, um, uh, who up until recently would cast only men. And I'd heard so much about them, but we saw them, and it was all parody and kind of everyone doing their shtick. Maybe I saw them on an off night, but it was I got no Shakespeare, no exploration out of it. I watched very very smart performers do some things they do really well, but it just I personally wasn't drawn to like going and seeing the show another night because I'm like I'm going to see the same thing, no matter what the audience suggestion is. So,
right.
so
Yeah. Yeah. That again, fine line between parody and pastiche. I like, and and even styles we've done because we've done some of my favorite styles are like just big stupid styles. Like years ago we did Elvis movies, and it was so much fun. But you have that line: are we making fun of it? And again, I go back to that idea of like, no, let's try to do an actual Elvis movie, because we can't, but we're going to try. And, stuff like that, I think that's a fine line to walk. Are there styles that you would like to do? Maybe styles you can't do because you think they're just not accessible to. Uh,
there are a lot of styles that like Sherlock Holmes, or even we've done Twilight Zone, but the shows with the O. Henry ending, I can come up with ways to do it that have sort of artificial way to generate that O. Henry ending, but I've not yet. I- I've seen people do the styles in a way I like. I haven't seen people nail the ending in a way I loved because I think it's such a different brain space to be in to come up with that like twist ending that really puts all the details together but is clever and the audience didn't predict but thought they should have because the audience, you say this a lot, the audience is way ahead of the improvisers, So it's going to be really hard to get ahead of the audience for an O. Henry ending. But I'd love to crack that nut and come up with some ways to do that. But I'd still want it to be a discovered ending.
Right.
Um, so uh, I would love to do that. The style I can never do, but he's my favorite playwright, and I think every improviser should go see his plays, is August Wilson. Um, but not being a person of color, who loves a director who said literally that no one who's not a person of color should ever direct one of his plays. It's not a genre I can do, but I would love to see performers of color improvise August Wilson, because he's such a. This is why it's a great style for improvisers to study. All the action is offstage in an August Wilson piece, and people come into the scene and talk about it. And that thing we say not to do, not to throw the action off stage. But if you're going to have big external conflict, you have to. So he does it in a way that's engaging and has high stakes. Um, so um, so I'd love to see more stuff like that on stage.
Cool. Yeah, it brings up that point about certain playwrights and styles have uh, what we would call improv bad habits in them. And again, the
Yes.
idea of like when we were working on Moliere, it was directing it, it was just trying to get the improvisers to not advance the plot because there is no advancement. It's all about expansion. It's all about chasing each other around. It's all about all of that stuff, not so much about like this big complicated plot. And it was really hard because it goes against every bone in your improv body, because you've been taught. So don't move it, move forward. Um, and Yeah, I would imagine that there, and that's also the thing with the O. Henry ending. When I was thinking about actually O. Henry, and going back to the laying eggs thing about like, in a way, you have to kind of lay those things out and then pay them off without knowing how they're being laid in the first place. So using that metaphor, and that idea of oh, I'm going to put this here. I don't know why I'm putting it here, but at
Yeah.
the end, I'm going to bring it back because I remember it, and then that's the payoff. I think that's part of the difficulty in anything with an O. Henry ending. So
Yeah. Um, yeah. All of those. I think that's there are a lot of improv rules that you have to throw out to do a specific style, like action off stage. There's tons of plays that have all the action off stage or in the back in the past, right? Most plays, the story's already happened, and you're just watching like the final steps in that story. So
right, and there are some skills that you think more experienced improvisers, and this is not even so much about genre work, just about improv. We've had those lots of discussions. You can say no to something and still be yes anding the offer versus everyone thinking everything has to be yes. Literally, yes, I'll do that. Yes, I'll. Right. And to me, the same is true. I remember Keith Johnson used to talk a little bit about what he called, he said, you want to learn to not block, right? You want to learn to not waffle, but he said there's creative blocking and there's creative waffling, which once you know what, supposedly once you kind of understand and can use those, then you can use those as tools. So that idea in Moliere of not moving forward implies that we know enough about the moving forward part of our narrative that we can stall it, stop it, hold it. I don't know. So, what are some of the genre styles that you do think would work well virtually?
a genre I love that I haven't cracked and I've not been satisfied when I've seen it is some fantasy genres. Uh, because I think there are ways to do it in the same way you can do science fiction on stage. Um, but it's got some real, you have to solve some real problems about, you can't go anywhere visually. And So you probably have to reframe that story quite a bit. Um, but I think there's some stuff there. I think magical realism with the right people could work, but I've literally tried it two or three times and just felt like we don't yet have the right pieces in play. Um, but I think I'd love to see more magical realism, and um, and maybe it's not maybe the U.S. You know, maybe it shouldn't be a U.S. show or a me a white person from the U.S. show. That may be one of the answers. Because there are just because and Felipe or
Ortiz.
Pepe from yes Ortiz said a great thing to my partner Janine that made me realize why we have so much trouble with it in Western culture, which is in magical realism. In Western fantasy, we like commoditize and commercialize the magic right away. Like, how is this useful, right? Oh, I can magically make fire immediately. How do I use it and put it to work? Whereas in magical realism, it just is, and you don't use it. It's not like it's not suddenly a tool for your characters to make use of. Um, but I think so. I think it would take a lot of getting into that type of thought. But I think it would be great to see someone
Right.
nail it.
Yeah, and in some ways, in magical realism, it seems to me like even that special skill of like making fires is something that the person is kind of ashamed of in a way because it
Yeah.
makes them different, uh,
Yes.
and that becomes part of the journey that the character goes on.
Yeah.
Um,
And I will say, I did see one great show. I'm gonna leave out one of their words. Parallelogramma Phonograph did a show, Box and String, with a local playwright that was magical realism, and I thought they nailed it because they didn't. They played it subtly enough, and they just like found those like the magical moments. They didn't talk about them. They didn't. Yeah. So I
right,
have seen it work.
right,
So,
and they're out of Austin, Texas.
yeah, out of Austin, at a hideout normally, out of their houses right now. So
uh, what genre do you think will respond to what we are going through, or will have gone through once theater is live?
ooh, zombie films.
We'll build a
Uh,
set like 9 squares, and
right. I
easy.
don't think we know what we're going through yet. They always said like I said, I was a poetry major, and it's like no good poems ever written for like 10 years after a thing happens. So it's pretty hard for me to know. I know what where people are missing, like connection, uh, and I have an idea of like what's being lost, but how to address that, at least for me, is too early to know. I have new answers every day that I'm sure are not correct. I don't know. Do you have thoughts, Randy? Or
Yeah, I don't have a specific genre at the time, but I think that connection thing and community thing is going to be important. So things and styles and genres that are bringing characters together, and I almost want to say in a positive way, as a way of kind of reconnecting that tissue. What that genre is, I don't know. Like I actually think uh, I would disagree with what you were saying, and maybe you were saying half jokingly about the zombie, because it's just like more of the same. Versus like how do we use theater to heal the wound, and find those reconnecting material, and genres. I don't know. Racking my brain to try to think of it, but I also think you're right. I mean, being in the middle of it, it's hard to sort of go. Plus, who knows what's going to happen? Um,
I have a sense, but I thought we were leaving this behind in the '90s. Like, there's right now nobody wants cynicism, and we're living in such an age of doubt and distrust, and like people like fighting with each other that it's not. I think the genre won't have that. It's that it needs to have some answers about how to overcome or get past that in order to even be watchable to me right now. Like, I've literally been binge watching The Next Generation because it's like competent people who get along and like each other. um, and it's not a cynical show. So
right.
I my guess is, I hope it might just be naive hope that there's a hunger for things without that cynicism or irony or all that.
Yeah, I almost think it boils down to maybe even a little less uh, Uber style, a little more inner. So maybe there are certain playwrights and things like that that are doing that might be good to one reconnect us, get us together, but it's also we're living in a world where the bus driver's a superhero, and so these ordinary stories of people who are first responders, medical professionals, lots of people, and they're not. these extraordinary people who, rich and they have everything and blah blah blah. And it's this huge thing. They're very ordinary stories, but have the same stakes and risk. I think that these other stories have. I've been fascinated by it. It kind of brings us back into genre, and then we can probably start wrapping it. Is it about time? The is that notion of when this first started, everybody writing about what Shakespeare had written when theater had stopped because of the plague, and King Lear being one of them. And so I've been kind of thinking about those as maybe a source to kind of go, well, what did they come up with during this time? And are we coming up with this? Where's that for us?
Yeah. The other thing I just keeps plugging, and this is more about the greater time we're living in. As much as I get angry at my rural relatives, they do have a real point that they're not represented in what we do because of polarization. And I don't mean like they necessarily need like it's not about political views. It's just about actual identity and way of life being represented on stage. Um, I'm not. I'm sure I'm never gonna do this, and it's a stupid idea. But I'm gonna throw it out there as like I've always wanted to do improvised Dukes of Hazzard, but the Dukes are black because they are currently occupying that place in our culture. It used to be white people were like, "Hey, the police are like corrupt and like problematic and these authoritarian figures," and then we went through this whole like well, it's broader parts of our community and like everything shifted. But I was like, if I could come up with like a show that would like hit both cultures and like represent something, it would be something like the Dukes of Hazzard. But because it's like one of the last shows I remember that really like was kind of honest, even though it wasn't written by or directed or performed by people who lived in the South, but it felt growing up in the South like this, like, oh, that's me. These are my people, right? Like, they have a place in this, like, and they're like, and it asks these big moral, ethical questions while being about cars jumping over each other. So,
No.
so that's my stupid genre. I would love to see on stage.
Uh, so Dave is asking, weirdly, 6 foot distancing is almost exactly the distance improvisers naturally want to stand from one another, and have to be directed away from it in shows. Maybe that'll change.
That'd be great. Yeah, I always say people stand the exact distance where you can't punch or kiss me without me having some warning. So,
Well, that's a warning.
yeah, I don't
Well,
think it's going to change in the next month or two, but maybe eventually. So,
right. What do you think? And this will be the last question, I think. What do you think about or what would you share to people who are potentially thinking about taking your genre class that starts on June 7th? As a sort of philosophical approach, are you approaching the class sort of like, oh, I'm approaching more as a director and I'm just directing them as though I might work with a group of actors? Or are you kind of showing an approach to a style, even if it's not the style you're working with?
I and this is true of my non-online classes. It'll be true in online. I do want you to walk away with an understanding of the styles and genres we look at, but I'm more concerned with what are all the ways like you break down a style so that you can either as a performer or as a show creator or as a director can like approach style in the future. And I both mean like when you've got 6 months to plan and create a show, and when you've got 30 seconds to like figure out how to do a style, or 5 seconds. So I kind of want to walk people through I walk people through the tools I use to do that, and I kind of just highlight a lot of the choices we're making without thinking about it, like
Right.
parody versus pastiche, or am I physically embodying it? Am I like doing it for comedy, so I'm hitting the things people remember, or am I like embodying the style in subtle ways the audience won't know why they recognize it, but they will.
Okay.
So it's more, I would say by far, it's the goal is to have an approach, but I also hope you walk away with like knowing the styles we cover
Okay. And
pretty
two
well.
quick follow-ups. Are you choosing styles, or is that going to be one of the discussions the class has?
I have picked four styles, which I probably should have remembered what I told Jill I would pick. I'm gonna look it up real quick.
Uh,
Um, but I know I'm doing film noir, even though I've done it more recently, because I think it will translate well to being done on camera a little bit. And there's so much language and so many resources for it. So it's a great one to cover. Um, Here we go. I'm going to just commit to these. We're going to do film noir. We're going to do Neil Simon. We're going to do Kurt Vonnegut. And we're going to do documentary style. So all things I think we can explore on camera and over Zoom, but they still give us like different type of stuff to adapt.
right,
Movie. I always try to do a movie film genre. I always try to do a playwright, and I generally try to do something either written or otherwise more internal.
right. And we should talk because I think Vonnegut would actually work well as a show online. We
Yeah.
were talking about that earlier. And I'm going to add a bonus question from Jason because it's an interesting question. They've all been interesting questions. Genres can seem a little intimidating to me because there's such a broad range of styles, each with their own parameters. Any specific tips on preparing as an improviser for the genre work and or navigating the range of existing content to absorb the rules of genres that frequently pop up in improv?
Um, there's an interesting. The end of your question sort of suggests like I have a few things to say about it. You may end up performing in places where people like, for a while on UP, every time there's a Western, someone has to roll across the stage as a tumbleweed, which is not. I know Randy's feelings about that kind of thing. If you're performing in a place, there's tons of shorthands that groups tend to have. I don't love that stuff because often what you're watching is people parodying the last people who did the style, not the style itself. But also, a couple of our newer performers pointed out what a barrier that is to entry to a new improv theater. If like one of our performers got honked for doing a Tennessee Williams scene a few months ago in a theater sports, and we kind of as we talked, we're like, well, I think they got honked for not doing it the way UP does it, not because it wasn't a completely authentic like potential way to do Tennessee Williams. Um, so so I'm not going to quite answer that except to just note that it exists, and I don't love that. And it's to me, it's more the job of the theater or the existing performers to educate, or I'd prefer open up. There's that. Now, in terms of like preparing just to generally do it, if I have like a very short amount of time to prepare, the most important things I would pick out were like who are the character archetypes, what do they want, and what are the rules they have to follow to get what they want. Because I'm going to be playing a character. I wouldn't worry so much about costumes or the fluff, and I actually wouldn't worry as much about narrative because for quick short stuff, that's a problem the group's going to have to solve. It's not necessarily going to help you as a performer. So I would start there. Who am I likely to be? Like Ray Bradbury. All right, there's going to be like some kind of monster character who may not be bad, but they're like mysterious. There's going to be somebody who like is paranoid, but turns out is right. There's going to be like the exploiter who like wants to exploit the planet or monster or magic. So like, and then you figure out what do they want? How do they want the world to be? And how do they go about getting it? That's where I would start. And that may sound intimidating, but you can literally be like, Neil Simon, I want to like just relax and have a drink and get along with people, right? That's enough in 30 seconds to maybe go off of, right? It's iterative, right? Each little bit you learn helps you play it a little bit more, and it's not about getting it perfect or knowing everything. It's just about having a first step in the door, I think.
Right. And it is skill. So as you do more in that genre, you build your skills and what skill set in terms of what you can do. And kind of in a little more general thing, talking about styles, I always say start with the basics. So the ones that come up all the time are the ones where you start, and then kind of follow it Tony's saying, get some real basic stuff down for the Tennessee Williams of the world that we get all the time, um, and and start there, because and then move on once you feel comfortable with all these basic styles to more special styles or style that you like in particular. Um, so, but the main thing is jump in, and I think the last thing Tony said is super important, that it doesn't have to be perfect, and it's not going to be perfect, and it's an ongoing thing. Every time we do a style, every time we do film noir, I've done it a million times, but I always find something new, in it to, bring to the table a little bit. So,
Cynthia says for Neil Simon, I want to laugh because I'm cheating with three women. I'm just going to add because I'm trying to cheat with three women, not succeeding. So,
all right. Anything else? You got time? Final words of wisdom?
That's I love style and genre, and I've played with it a lot and talked about it a lot, and we've thrown out a lot. But I think there are opportunities. So you can look at it as like all this stuff I have to learn, in which case it's going to be intimidating, but more just like each little thing you learn. And also, you already know a ton of genres, right? I was telling our newer performers, it's like just because born in 1976, Tony has like his list of styles. Um, it's like you probably have things you love. Like, how does it start with those styles? How do they, and like ask the things I like, well, why does that happen? And also, what are the parts I've never noticed before that make the stuff I love work? Like, you can just start with questions about stuff you like and get really far.
Cool.
So,
Well, thanks to Tony. Hopefully you'll take his class starting June 7th,
yeah.
4 to 6.
Yes.
And you already know the styles that he's going to be teaching, so you're a little ahead of the game. We have lots of shows going on. So tonight we have a mom show, since tomorrow's Mother's Day. So it'll be a few of the mothers from our company will be doing a show together, both about mom themed stuff and non-mom themed stuff. And then next week we have a full array of shows, duos on Wednesday, Improv Anonymous with guests on Thursday, happy hour on Friday, and then another unexpected experiments on Saturday. And then also next Saturday, we'll be doing one of these as well. And the guest I already have lined up for next week is Trixie Brunschko from Graz, Austria.
Oh, awesome.
So she'll be here, and she and I will be chatting about stuff, improv stuff. And as usual, thank you for coming, because we love you spending time with us. Hope to see you sooner rather than later in the theater. And if you feel like making a donation, we would appreciate that as well, because we're really working hard to hold on to the Market Theater and everything that stands for. So thank you guys very much.
Yeah, thanks for being here.